us. If you would like to ask a question, you can text your question to 859-474-0319. So, all right. And those are my big announcements. And so at this point, let us just pause a moment as I light the Christ candle and welcome the peace of Christ into this place. And now let us pray. We remember your word, O Lord, from Isaiah. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. God of comfort, we pray, send your spirit to encompass all those whose lives are torn apart by violence and death in Israel and Palestine. You are the advocate of the oppressed and the one whose eye is on the sparrow. Let arms reach out in healing rather than aggression. Let hearts mourn rather than militarize. God of justice, give strength to those whose long work for a just peace might seem fruitless now. Strengthen their resolve and do not let them feel alone. Show us how to support their work and bolster their courage. Guide us and all religious leaders to model unity and reconciliation across lines of division. Guide leaders of all political persuasions to listen with their hearts as they seek peace and pursue it. Help all people, O Lord, choose the righteous path of just peace and disavow violence. God of love, we lift up Palestine and Israel and its people, its land, all the creatures who live there. War is a monster that consumes everything in its path. Peace is a gift shared at meals of memory with Christians and Muslims and Jews. Let us burn incense and not people's bodies. Let us break bread and not buildings. Let us plant olive groves and not cemeteries. We beg for love and compassion to prevail on all your holy mountain. God of hope, we lift up the cities of the region, so long divided and yet so filled with life and creativity. Come again to breathe peace on your people, that all may recognize you. God of mercy, even now, work in the hearts of combatants to choose life over death, reconciliation over retaliation, restoration over destruction. Help us resist anti-Semitic actions and words in all forms, especially in our churches. All people, Israelis and Palestinians, deserve to live in peace and deserve to live unafraid, with a right to determine their future. God of the nations, let not one more child or elder be sacrificed on altars of political expediency. Keep safe all people from unjust leaders who would exploit vulnerability for their own distorted ends. Give wise discernment to those making decisions to pursue peace. Provide them with insight into fostering well-being, freedom, and thriving for all. Teach all of us to resolve injustices with righteousness and not rockets. Guard our hearts against retaliation and give us hearts for love alone. Strengthen our faith in you, O God of all flesh, even when we don't have clear answers, so that we may still offer ourselves nonviolently to the cause of peace. Amen.
My name is Edward Good, and I am pastor at Christ Church, UCC, right down the street here. And as Pastor Amy said, I also welcome you to this time tonight. So I have known Dr. Nicholas, or Dean, for almost probably 15 years now, something like that. And we have shared many lunches together at the Silver Spring House, right across the street from Cincinnati Hills Christian Academy, of sharing about our lives, praying with one another, and just listening to how God is at work in our respective lives and ministries. One of the things that Dean shared many times in our conversations were about his visits to the Holy Land that he has done with CHCA and with some other organizations, and invited me on more than a few occasions, and I have yet to go, and deeply regret that at this point. But as Amy and I were talking about an opportunity to be able to go and get it a little bit beneath the surface of what we are reading, what we are seeing about the conflict between Palestine and Israel right now, we thought of Dean immediately as someone who can kind of help get at some of the history, as well as from his own experience on the ground and the relationships he's built there. So Dean is the head of school at Cincinnati Hills Christian Academy, and PhD in Hebrew Studies from Hebrew Union College here in our area. So Dean, welcome you on up.
Thank you for having me here. Where's the best place for me to be? Is it here? For the... Okay, I see, there. I'm out of the spotlight. That helps. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to just be here with you today to talk a bit about what's going on in the world. We turn on the TV and it is about as upsetting as can be, and it's one of those things. For people who know me, I'm pretty optimistic. When Ed and I get together and with another friend and we talk about all the problems and all the things going on, usually I'm the person with the, hey, but if we just do this and I'm that person to the point where some people find it irritating. And I have found myself in the past few weeks having a very different attitude. And so to me, that's troubling, as I'm just self-reflective for myself when I feel like I can't look and say, but here's the silver lining and here's what's going to happen. And so I've been talking about this a lot with students and with other folks, and so I appreciate the chance to be here and to talk with you today. I want to share a little bit about my background, about how I end up in this situation. I always feel if you kind of know where a person is coming from, you get a better sense. I have, as I've been talking about this, and I was joking a little bit with Ed about this today, I've taught Bible and Christian studies in all kinds of contexts. I've worked in a Christian school a long time. I've talked about all kinds of things. And I thought after a whole long career, talking on this topic feels like the one that gets you canceled. So I'm going to say right now, if anything I say you find offensive, we'll just say either I misspoke or you misunderstood and everything's good. Because what I will say to you in all seriousness, I'm not here as a person with an agenda to say, I'm going to tell you who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in this, because there's plenty of that to go around. If you get to the end and you go, oh, he's one of those, super Zionist people, or if you get down, oh, he's all about the Palestinians, then also I either misspoke or you misunderstood, is because I live in this space where I would say I'm pro-Israel, I'm pro-Palestinian, I'm pro-peace. How do we find a way for people to live in a very complicated place? This story for me actually starts when I was a senior in high school. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a place in many ways kind of like the greater Cincinnati area, this big German kind of population. I'd never been in a state non-contiguous with Wisconsin. I'd never been on an airplane before. And I ended up getting the chance to go to Israel for a month of my senior year. It was a program between the American Council of Greater City Schools, the Israeli government, the American government. We were considered youth ambassadors. And they said, Israel and America are each other's greatest allies, and all we know of each other are the things we see on TV. So they said, let's get teenagers together, let them spend time, let them tour each other's countries, let them live in host families, let them be in schools. And that is when I actually fell in love with so many things that are a big part of my life today. So I spent the month of November of 1986 living with a host brother in Tel Aviv, a host brother in Haifa, and a host sister in Jerusalem. And I got to see the country not as a tourist, but in a way where I was making new friends and becoming part of their family, and I would do life with them. And I fell in love with Israel. And I heard its story, and I heard its history, and I learned about the people and its religion and its culture and the dilemmas and struggles. I came home, and soon it was Christmas, and I was with all my relatives. And again, I grew up in a church home. At that point, I was sure I was going to be a pastor one day, and so I was kind of gearing up for I was going to be a person preaching every week, and I'm like, wow, this is great. I have this Israel experience. And I start telling my family on the Nicholas side at Christmas all this amazing stuff that I'd seen, learned, experienced. And then this really weird thing happened. You see, on my dad's side of the family, his dad and their whole family came from Lebanon and Syria. And I'm telling all this really great stuff I did, and all of a sudden, the more cantankerous of my relatives, my great-uncle George, he starts yelling at me that you've just been brainwashed. You're one of these, with all kinds of colorful language, Zionists who do all these terrible things. And I'm like, what in the world is he talking about? I just had this great experience. I have all these friends now. And like, I'm a high school kid, so I get in this argument with my great-uncle George. We're going back and forth, and my view of some of the things he was talking about, I had no place to categorize it, no place to think about it. And I just went on from that there was this great place that I'd been a part of, Israel, and anyone who had anything negative to say about it somehow was either anti-Semitic or they had some other kinds of issue, and I simply ruled it out. But I then went off to college, and I was like, well, I have to study a language. I want to study Hebrew because I was in Israel. And when I was becoming a Bible and theology major, I'm like, well, I'm going to focus on Old Testament stuff because this connects to Israel. And it started this trajectory for me that as I continued through college, then it was like, I think I actually want to go into graduate school and get a PhD. And the professor I TA'd for, my Hebrew teacher, he was a person who got his doctorate at Hebrew Union College, led me to Cincinnati. And I'm building this background of understanding better Judaism and Israel and the Near East. And someone gave me a book that changed a whole lot of things for me. I get books all the time from all kinds of people, and I have this stack, and my wife complains about it. And I get to them eventually. And I eventually get to this book. It was called Blood Brothers by Elias Shakur, who is an Israeli-Palestinian Christian who eventually became the Archbishop of the Galilee. And I read this book, and it's like, wait, this doesn't fit anything I'd ever heard before. And I lived in this cognitive dissonance of how is this true and how is everything else I've experienced true. And that book opened for me this experience of saying, I need to meet other people, talk to other people, see other things that I hadn't seen before in Israel. And when I went and I told some people at a Palestinian Christian school in Nazareth about all my students that I had taken to Israel had read this book, and they go, oh, well, are you going to talk with him? I'm like, wait, what? And they're like, are you going to meet with him? He lives right down the road. And it was kind of like, wait, you can do that? And from that moment forward, every trip I take, people read that book, and we visit the school that he started, and sometimes we get an audience with Abuna Shakur. And it led to meeting people in the Bethlehem community and Christians there and Muslims there. And my life got so much more complicated, but beautiful. So let me tell you what I want us to do today. I want to share with you the background of what is going on today that gives us a context. But here's something I'm going to promise you, and I've been teaching a long time, and for some of my students, they really like this, and for others, it makes them hate me. You are not going to walk out of here with okay, I really get it now, and I have the answer. You're going to leave maybe feeling a lot more muddled than clarity that you might have in your mind right now, because, and I always say this to people on my trips, like if you go and you come out and you go, I got the answer now, it's like I didn't do a good enough job. I want you to feel the complexity of this. There is a professor that I read recently. He teaches at Grove City College, and he starts his history class every year on the first day. He says, we're going to start with a true or false question. And he said, on 9/11, the Twin Towers fell because of gravity. And the students are in this, wait, yes? Right? They say, well, yes, on one level, that's why the towers fell, of course. But to really understand the depth of why they fell, we're going to have to look at Islam in the modern world. We're going to have to look at American foreign policy. We're going to have to look at, because there's all these complexities to it. I worry sometimes when people talk about this issue, we give too often a gravity answer. People will say, well, because Genesis 12 says, or well, if you read Genesis 16, or well, if you read Ezekiel, and we have simple answers of a text, a comment, a thing you heard once, and we really easily go, this can be straightened out if we just get those bad people who are doing the wrong thing, and you can pick or choose who your bad people are, but it's a lot more than that. So what I want to do, and I'm going to take up my phone, not because I'm texting, but I want to keep making sure, once I get going on this, I'll talk for way too long, and so I'm going to try to stay with us. Let me make sure I can make the technology work. Do I have the right angle? See if you can get to work from there. There we go. All right. Is this, which button am I hitting here? This? I think it's just angle. Can we turn the computer? Which part of the thing am I, what am I aiming for? All right. Can I come to the floor? Is this fine? Does it work from here? All right. We read the studies. Americans don't do geography well, but I will just put this up there, right? If you can recognize where we're at. We're in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the yellow is our current day Israel. And you see the neighborhood, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Israel is a pro-Western democracy in the Middle East, which is a great reason for the political ties between the U.S. And Israel. Oh, yeah, no, I'm pointing over here. Okay, I'll get this right. All right, here's the map up close. Israel is the size of the state of New Jersey. Okay, it's not a big place. And if you look, this area in gray, or lavender, whatever that is, this is what we call West Bank. This area right here is this is Gaza. Okay? And again, size of New Jersey, Israeli fighter planes are crossing it widthwise 45 seconds, right? We're not talking a really big piece of property. And what I want us to talk about is a lot of this conversation is around land and whose is it? And so if you, like me, had that little Bible as a kid with those great maps in the back, it usually started with this one. This is our tribal confederation. If you go back, let me come to this side. This might make the clicker work better. Can you film from here? Is this okay? If you look at this map, and here's what I want to point out, is that this idea of what is Israel geographically is something that isn't a fixed, easy thing to describe. When people say, well, if you go back to the Bible, it's interesting in the Bible, because if you look at this conglomeration of tribes, before Israel's a nation, but it's a group of tribes, this area up here is currently Lebanon, and this area over here is currently Syria, and this area over here is currently Jordan, but all these places are part of Israel. And Israel would come all the way down somewhere down here, but those weren't part of Israel in biblical time. So when you go back to that pre-monarchy, they kind of overlaps, but it's not exactly what Israel is today. And if you look at the time during King David and Solomon, Israel is this, which again, parts of Jordan, parts of Israel, but Edom and Moab. Edom was part of what's now Israel. And again, same thing, parts of Lebanon, Syria, and then other things, right? And during this period, Israel's just this. And it's not this stuff with Jerusalem. That was part of Judah. So again, there's overlap, but it's not exact. You can just use like the left and right arrow on the keyboard. Yeah, that might help me. That's a map probably most people haven't seen. This is during the Hasmonean period. After the Maccabees, and for about 100 years, it's called 100 years, it's a little shorter technically, you have a Jewish state. They mint coins, and this is what it looked like. And again, doesn't fully overlap. There's always this interesting little gap over there, which is kind of where Gaza is now, a little bit south of there. This is during the Hasmonean period before the Romans come. Okay? Kind of overlaps with modern-day Israel, but not exact. And then, interesting period of time is during the Roman period. The Romans come in, end of the Hasmonean period. The Romans take over this whole place, and they give it a new name. This is the period during the beginning of the Roman Empire in the Middle East that they call this area Palestina. The word Palestine begins during the era of the Romans. Now, here's a really interesting thing, and I want to emphasize this because there's great bad stuff on this. It would never happen with, these well-educated folks, but sometimes pastors will say this thing, which sounds really good, and it's horrible, because it's just not true. This territory, Palestine, that is taking the word from ancient Hebrew, Philistine. The word Philistine is the word that the Romans name this area. So Palestina is a Romanized form of the word for Philistine. But sometimes people mix Bible and history in this really confused way where they say, well, of course, the Jews and the Palestinians are fighting. This goes all the way back to King David and Goliath, and Israel and the Philistines were always enemies. Philistines and Palestinians have no genetic, ethnic, cultural, historical, anything in common. It's a word that named the place. So in the same way, I grew up in Milwaukee, but that doesn't make me a Menominee tribal person. That just happens to be the name, where the name comes from. But from the period of the Romans onward, the place was called Palestina. That's where Palestine comes from. Now, what's really interesting is that Hasmonean picture, from that point until 1948, there was no country or state called Israel. Okay? So it was Palestina from then on. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is in 70, when the Romans destroy the temple and then what's called the diaspora, Jews are scattered throughout the world. But there were always Jews who continued to live there. There was always a Jewish presence there. But we'll talk about that a little later. All right, so let's get to the next part. What's an Arab? And again, that's a whole day, but I'm going to do this in one slide, so you're going to get some great condensed ethnography. Arabian folk come out of the Arabian Peninsula, where Saudi Arabia is. This happens again, 9th century BCE, really early. The Nabateans, if you've ever been to like Petra, like that's evidence of groups that were actually Arab groups, Arab backgrounds. Herders, Bedouins. Another thing that gets said that's just not correct is the story in Genesis where Hagar has her son Ishmael, and she's told he's going to have great peoples come from him. He's going to be a wild ass of a man, and he's always going to be in conflict with his brethren, good King James. Some folks will take that passage and say Ishmael becomes the Arabs. Again, what can happen? Jews and Arabs will always be at each other's throat because it was prophesied all the way back in Genesis. The scripture says Ishmael's offspring. And Ishmael has offspring, and they're in the Bible, and they're called the Ishmaelites. And in the context of scripture, it's the Ishmaelites who are coming along and buy Joseph when his brothers throw him in the pit, and he sells him into slavery, which fulfills what that passage says. It's like, oh yeah, like look at, there's conflict between brothers. They sold a brother into slavery. It's actually the Quran that is trying to read back into the story that we fit into that narrative that makes the connection that says, remember Ishmael, he's from Abraham too. He's actually our ancestor. So again, that's a tradition one can believe. Just know that that comes from Quran, not from our Bible. Okay, back, you see our area. So let's back up. Let's now tell the story of modern Israel. This region is controlled from the Roman period, and there will be invader after invader. But the one that makes the most interest for us to talk about is in the 16th century, so 1500s, we have the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire comes out of Turkey. They're not Arabs, but they are Muslims. They control the territory of Palestine. If you have traveled to, or God willing, one day we'll all travel to Israel together, the walls that we see of the old city of Jerusalem, those are actually Ottoman walls. It's the Ottomans that built those. All right, so they go way back. During this Ottoman period, this person, you might not recognize him, this is Theodore Herzl. This is like the George Washington of Israel. Here, let me back up. He writes a book called Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And it said, you know what? We have suffered and been persecuted and have been without a home throughout our history. It is time for Jews to have a homeland. There was actually debate around where that should be, and there were some saying Uganda or Argentina. But again, in the end, what wins out is historical tradition to say we should be in our original homeland of Palestine. And then this really interesting phrase becomes part of that dialogue because he starts to say, Jews begin to emigrate, go and let's start building communities in our old homeland. And the phrase was, a people without a land for a land without a people. And you will still hear that sometimes. Now, you've had Arab communities living in this land who have lived in a place that they call Palestine, and so they've developed a cultural identity around being Palestinian. Now remember, this is Western nationalism, right? And so all these things that we end up calling countries form after the Ottoman Empire falls apart. But so there are people who see themselves as Palestinian who live here, and now you're beginning to get Jews from Europe who are starting to settle in little communities around the territory. There was some conflict, but by and large, it was not a problematic situation because, again, there had been Jews living there in some form the entire time. Now, there were different types of Jewish communities, but we'll deal with that later. So they're coming to this land, and then, important date, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, which falls at the end of World War I, this becomes the time when European nations start divvying up the Middle East. And part of this is the Balfour Declaration. And I'm going to read along for us. Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So as this territory is being divided up, the British become the ones who have control over what is now called Palestine, what is now called Jordan, and you have the French who have control over Lebanon and Syria. You also have the British with control over Iraq, and these are artificial Western constructs, which, again, if you read some of the history around the time when our own country got into all this stuff about trying to do nation building in Iraq, and it's like, why won't these people just get along? It's because there is no ancient tradition of people seeing themselves as Iraqis. They see themselves as Sunnis and Shias and Kurds that got held together by Saddam Hussein. But you break that up and it all comes apart. You have this British influence in the period, and this is one of those things. I had this really cool intercession trip where I took students from school to go do a service project in Bethlehem in January, and we were there for Eastern Orthodox Christmas Eve and Christmas. And so we go to this Christmas Eve parade in Bethlehem, and it's all the scouting troops. And every scouting troop is led by people playing bagpipes. My students are like, what the heck? And they're like, I didn't know this came from the Middle East. It's like, it didn't. It came with the British. You go to Jordan, every wedding, it's led in by people playing bagpipes. All right, you have this colonialism as part of this space. And so the British, though, said, we want to make sure that there is a homeland that gets established for the Jews. Then there was the British Mandate, League of Nations, like we're going to keep moving this forward, that there would be a Jewish state. But again, the key part was always, but we'll protect the other groups in the land. Nothing really happens with this. And then we come to World War II. And if you study Judaism, you have to understand the fact that from the very beginning, they have been persecuted. They were persecuted in places in the Middle East. They were persecuted in Europe, probably worse in Europe than anywhere else. And we even sit now and we see the rise of anti-Semitism even in our own country. And so the Zionist ideal of saying we need a nation where we can be the ones in control, we're the ones with the power, the rest of the world post-Holocaust said this is something that should happen, and the UN decided to put to a vote to create a Jewish state in the area, in a part of the area that was Palestine. And so at that point, I always say this is the map that no one's ever seen. This was the partition plan. You look at it on paper and you go, who thought this was going to work? But they said, let's build nations based on where certain populations already exist. Okay? So your yellow areas would be the Arab state called Palestine. The orange would be a Jewish state called Israel. And notice the white box around Jerusalem. See this? This was going to be an international city that was controlled by neither. Because Jerusalem is claimed as a holy city for the three major monotheistic religions. It is, in Jewish tradition, it is the capital established by King David, which goes back 3,000 years. It's where Solomon built the temple, which means it's the place in which the divine inhabited. Within Christianity, this is the holy city, right, where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected. And with Islam, it's the place in which Muhammad ascended into heaven. And so it's the third holiest city for Islam. And so the UN says, if we're going to give this to one of those groups, we're going to have a problem. So let's make it like the Vatican. It's its own independent little place. We'll run it, keep it safe, so everyone gets access to their holy sites. Okay? So there's a vote on this plan. It passes. The U.S., from the very beginning, a supporter of Israel, votes on behalf of it. But none of the surrounding Arab countries voted on behalf of it. And the people who live there didn't get a vote. And so we come to a day that has two opposite meanings. May 14th, 1948, if you're an Israeli, this is your 4th of July, 1776. This is Independence Day. This is when you again got your homeland. If you are Palestinian or an Arab, you call this day the Nakba, which means the catastrophe, because it's the day in which you lost everything. So this day carries all kinds of weight, but with the exact opposite emotions for both peoples. And it was on this day that all of Israel's neighbors attacked, thinking the UN can declare it, but we will wipe it out. And from the very beginning, Israel began a life in conflict. That's all I'll say about that for now. Because we'll talk about this dynamic will continue. There is this moment, and again, think about this on a psychological level. You are a people group who almost to a person, either directly or very closely to you, are connected to survivors of the Holocaust, who just form a new nation where you can finally be the government, the military, the strength, right, to defend yourself. And in day one, all your neighbors attack with the mindset, and again, the vitriolic language, which some people will still say, is from the river to the sea, this idea like, we will wipe them out. And that was day one, which contributed to a mindset of, in Israel, even to this day, is that we always have our backs against the wall, and people, if we give them a chance, will wipe us out. And so day one, war starts. But the thing is, Israel defended itself so that we have a shift, so that, look at this, all the blue and red areas end up in Jewish control, which gives us that picture. Except at the original point, This area, which gets called West Bank, is controlled by Jordan. And this area, which is Gaza, is controlled by Egypt. From this point forward, there is continual conflict and minor skirmishes, but there's this continual experience of Israel as seeing itself as constantly under attack, needing to defend itself from both those internal and those external. Okay? Now, there's one thing to point out is that as this is happening, you have a couple times when it goes beyond small skirmishes and it turns into actual wars. I've been using this in class, and I pulled a picture out because no students recognize the person. You guys would have. 1964 is the beginning of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its leader, Yasser Arafat. It's in this context that they're like, wait, we were supposed to get a country out of this. And yes, outside neighbors attacked, but wait, shouldn't we have some kind of territory and representation? And so the PLO uses attacks in Israel and globally to draw attention to this plight of the Palestinian people. Then, in 1967, what becomes known as the Six-Day War, once again, all the Arab neighbors begin to come troop movement to their borders to attack Israel once again. This is a really interesting one, and I want to take just a second. I'm going to grab my phone here. I got to make sure I stay on time. This is one of those things where there has been a perspective on what has happened, but there's also one of those things where as they declassify information, we learn more and more about a scenario. Israel is seeing its neighbors on all sides bring forces to the borders. Within Israel, there is this mindset. Not just mindset, it's being proclaimed like we are probably in our final hour. We are backed into a corner. The whole world is coming at us again, and no one will support us. The U.S. said they wouldn't get involved. No Western countries were going to come to the aid of Israel. And within Israel, it was talked about that it's just us, and pray that God on our side, like in days of old, will protect us, and that we somehow miraculously will overcome. Google it, look on YouTube, History Channel. When you hear about the greatest military, brilliant plans and attacks of all time, you hear about the Israelis in the Six-Day War and how they were waiting to be attacked, and then they had a surprise attack, and they wiped out the entire Jordanian and all the other countries' air forces before they got a plane in the air. They had total air domination. There are all these issues with the tanks of the Egyptians getting stuck in the sand. And you will hear about this Six-Day War, and I grew up hearing about this, and this was the story of, like in Bible times in Gideon, about God's miraculous deliverance of Israel. Or for the secularists who God Shmad, this is an example of Israeli military might and air superiority and just incredible military. As documents have become declassified, we read about the American military leaders discussing this situation and about helping Israel and ally. And there are transcripts of this, of people saying, Israel's going to slaughter these people in 8 to 10 days, and we don't want to be a part of this because it's going to make us look really bad to participate in this slaughter of the Arab nations. And so, again, this is the beauty of, maybe call it the over-information age, where we come to learn everything, and that so much is driven by public opinion and marketing and propaganda, and this picture of Israel was on its last leg and was, barely going to survive. It kind of comes out as that's not how the military establishment saw what was about to happen. But this 6-day war you will often hear of, especially in American religious circles, of this is the evidence that God is always with Israel, and so don't ever not support Israel. But that's for later. This becomes an issue because Israel, during the 6-day war, takes over the West Bank. They take over Gaza. They take over the entire Sinai Peninsula, which is Egypt, which gives them access to the canal and all shipping. And they take over the Golan Heights in Syria. Like, you're on the brink, about to be attacked, and you end up taking large swaths of territory of your combatant neighbors. And if you have this conversation with anyone in the Middle East, the first thing you're going to hear about is UN Resolution 242. And both sides will yell about the other side in Resolution 242. 2 parts to this resolution. 1, withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. This happens right after, in 1967. Israel is still in every one of those territories. Palestinians will yell, 242. UN resolution makes Israel a nation. It also tells it to get out, and why won't they? Look at part 2. Termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. Israel says, wait, we aren't recognized. At this point, no nation around them even referred to them as Israel. I called them the Zionist state. They didn't recognize them as a nation, and they did not leave them in peace. So the Arab nations say, listen, 242, get out of the territories. Israel says, hey, 242, when we're acknowledged as having sovereign political rights and we can live in peace, we'll get out of the territories. Do you see the way this dilemma works? Then, this picture is the one that makes me feel strange and old. I'm showing this to my students in school the other day, and I'm like, do you recognize anybody in this picture? Somebody said, is the guy in the middle Trump? No. I said, but close, he's an American president. George Bush? No. Grover Cleveland? I said, I don't even know what Grover Cleveland looks like. Nobody knows who this is anymore. The most important moment, and still I would say the most significant moment in changing the trajectory and possibility in the Middle East, that put the U.S. in the middle of it forever after. And it is because of not Grover Cleveland, but President Jimmy Carter, who has a background in a Southern Baptist church, who reads his Bible like I did as a kid, who thought, I just want to know about Israel and love to go to Israel, and he had that same thing. But in that process, he begins to meet Arabs as well. And he lives in this complexity. And he brings to Camp David Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat, Israeli prime minister and Egyptian president. And if you haven't read 13 Days in September and read about this Camp David, it's the way peace was brokered between what was a close personal friendship with Anwar Sadat and his wife, and strong mutual respect with Menachem Begin and playing to his feelings for his grandchildren about what you could do to move this forward, peace for their life. Jimmy Carter and American negotiators helped make this happen. And what it did is it formed the first recognition of Israel by any Arab neighbor. And so Egypt recognizes Israel, makes peace with Israel. Anwar Sadat goes to Israel. No one would step foot. They negotiated the return of the Sinai Peninsula and the beginning of talks about what would it look like for us now to form a Palestinian state. They sign a peace treaty which still stands. Blessed are the peacemakers. Sadat assassinated October 6, 1981 by one of his own countrymen because you don't make peace with Israel. But the peace has stood. It's been tense sometimes, but it has stood. And Anwar Sadat's daughter continues to try to move this work forward by bringing Israeli children and Egyptian children together. And again, you do these virtual history things. People can have all different kinds of political views on all kinds of things. But there's part of me that feels like if Carter had a second term, we might not be here because I think they maybe would have worked this out. They were moving toward it. They had momentum. We'll let that be. This is actually the first time I was in Israel in high school, is when the first Intifada was starting, which means shaking or uprising. And these are the pictures many of us, think of the past, the fighting, the David Goliath boy in a stone in an Israeli tank. This was late 80s, went into the early 90s, and this idea of how would we make peace, and again, notice this ends, I don't say it on here, but this comes to an end. Oh, it's for the Madrid conference. See this right here? Here's what's really important, and I want you to understand this. It was the coalition that George Bush brought together to fight the first Gulf War of Arab nations that allowed them to leverage that to say, you know what, let's sit down now and solve this Israel-Palestine thing. So they have the meetings in Madrid, and there was this real momentum, and here were the key issues that needed to be solved. What would be the final boundaries of the states? What to do about the settlements? The Israelis started building settlements in West Bank territories and in Gaza. Water rights. Jerusalem, who gets to have it? Right? Remember, it started out, it was going to be nobody's. Currently, the east side is Arab, the west side is Jewish. And last, right of return. Anyone that can show Jewish heritage can return to Israel. Palestinians say, shouldn't we be able to? So these are the 5 issues. They're like, we can work it out, and then we'll work through these. I bring these up because I want to point out one thing, because these are the subtle things we miss sometimes. What should happen with Jerusalem? For all of Israel's history, all the nations of the world, knowing this complexity on Jerusalem, put their embassies in Tel Aviv. All right, second largest city, business capital of Israel. Jews sometimes offended, like, we think Jerusalem's our capital, so you should put your embassies here. They'd have consulates, but not their embassies. When when Trump ran for president, he said, we side with Israel, we'll put our embassy there. Again, I'm not getting into politics today. Some of you might get, that was a great idea, we should. Others might go, no, that's terrible, because this is one of the final things they're supposed to work out. He gets elected, he follows through on that campaign promise. The part that felt terrible in this part of the world was, remember back to that day called Israel Independence, or Nakba, May 14th? We moved our embassy on May 14th, which was a very intentional moment that Israelis read one way and Palestinians read another. And there's these moments sometimes where it just causes extra grind. So let me get you caught up. This happens then in 93 Oslo Accords, and this actually is a really important part that gets us to why we have the problem of today. They decided they would divide up the West Bank to begin to move toward creating a Palestinian independent state. And they said, we will have A areas, and these are the dark brown ones. These areas are totally under Palestinian control. They will be the government, and they will be the security. They'll be the military. Israeli military can't go in. And the Palestinian Authority is actually a political party called Fatah, which was the old PLO. Yasser Arafat and the PLO, that becomes the Palestinian Authority. Then they say B areas. These are the light brown ones. You have Palestinian Authority government, but Israel still runs the security by having its military in place. And then the C areas, all the white areas. And the plan was, this roadmap for peace was that in 5 years, we would transition B areas to A areas, C areas to B areas, eventually B areas to A areas. So within a 5-year period, from 93 to 98, it would become an independent Palestinian state. Now, the person leading the government at that time, moving Israel toward peace, was Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin makes peace with Jordan. Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by an Israeli. And the peace process really kind of died with him. 93 to 98 was going to turn the whole thing into an A area in an Israeli, Palestinian state. There has not been one change of one piece of territory from B to A, from C to B. It's exactly as it was with, see all those blue areas? Those are Jewish settlements of Jewish folks who say, you know what, this land shouldn't be given back and we don't want them to have it. And so they build little towns and communities, and they strategically build them between A areas and B areas, so it's like you can't merge them, and these become these territorial hotspots. And you know how in American politics you can know where somebody stands on issues based on what language they use? The political term for this area is West Bank. But if you're a person who believes this should never be given back and get rid of the Palestinians, or they got to figure it out, but this is all to be Israel, they refer to it as Judea and Samaria, because those are Bible words. West Bank is like made up political jargon by UN and others. It's Judea and Samaria. We're not giving these up. This is our dilemma. And because of that, and I'm just going to fly by this, but the second Intifada, this happened in 2000. It was very violent. All the things you saw with the bombings and the bombings of buses, and this is the second Intifada. Very ugly. Now, again, remember I told you this is the Twin Towers falling, right? All this backdrop of this tension for a state, the feeling of we had progress, we had a plan, nothing happens. New plan, nothing happens. Gaza, the thin strip. There were Israeli settlements in it. The Israelis said, you know what, we're taking the settlements out. Fully Palestinian. Leave it to the Palestinians. There was an election. And this is where it gets sticky. There was an election in 2006. You have Fatah, you have the PLO as a political party, the Palestinian Authority. It's been since 1993. It is now 2005, and many Palestinians are like, nothing's happened. We haven't gotten any benefit. Our situation isn't any better. But they're like, you know what? These leaders, they're getting richer and richer. They're working with the Israelis, but they're not helping our side. And so there was an election in Gaza of who they wanted as their leaders. And they voted in Hamas, which is a Muslim party. Israel, U.S., the West, this is considered a terrorist organization. They have a militant wing. Again, I want to be really careful here. It's a political party. It's led by a religious ideology. But for many Palestinians, they said, you know what, but they're well educated. They build hospitals and schools and have social programs. They will help us more. And they saw, I was like, well, and they have the military wing, and they'll fight for us. So they win an election. But Fatah said, you know, win Shmin, we're not stepping down. And so a year later, Hamas fights Fatah and takes control. Now again, this is, and I go into this for a really interesting reason. You read different reports about when people talk about how did Hamas gain power. Sometimes in the West we just hear, well, yeah, they took power by force. Well, technically that's true, but they also won power in a fair election that had Western oversight. Right? So it's kind of a both and. But because it was considered a terrorist organization, Israel's like, well, we'll deal with the government in the West Bank, but we will not deal with them, which began an embargo since 2007. They control what goes in or out. They control how far they can go out into the sea, and they're limited from getting to the best fishing grounds. It's caused a situation in a place where, let me just show you this. This is Gaza. This is Washington, D.C. It's two Washington, D.C.s, but triple the population. It is the most densely inhabited place on the face of the earth. It is in abject poverty, 2.2 million people, and 50% of the population is 18 or below. So from 2007 on, during this embargo, you will have these missiles that get shot by Hamas into Israel. Israel has something called the Iron Dome or Iron Shield. It's a incredible technology. The U.S. was part of that. Shoots most missiles out of the air. Some do get through, but they're unsophisticated missiles, so they're not guided. They sometimes hit things, sometimes land in the middle of nowhere. But this happens a lot. So if you live in southern Israel, you hear the warning sirens fairly often. And this is like really cynical, but this is Israel's own language. Every 2 to 3 years, they say it's like our regular mowing the lawn, where they say we have to just bomb Gaza to take out the capabilities of Hamas. So it's going to take them a few more years to build back up again. And this just happens all over and over. And it's really like, I had a group going to Israel, and we were supposed to, it was after COVID, and Israel had a date when it was finally going to let tourists back in. And then a war with Gaza broke out. And my whole group was like, oh no, we're getting our trip. They'd already been canceled twice. Like, they're going to cancel our trip again because of this fight. And I'm like, trust me, it's going to end. No, I've been watching the news. It's so bad. I said, trust me. So my good friend and regular guide, Munzer, calls me. Like, it was like 36. It wasn't even. It was like, it might have been 36 hours before we were supposed to go. Good news, ceasefire. Everybody stopped. Because everyone knew, like, okay, we do this thing regularly, but we all need the tourist dollar, so let's stop the fighting so we don't scare the Americans away. And this regularly happens. They smuggle things in through tunnels, and they're funded by Iran, who is enemies with Israel, but in the end, you use your proxies, right? What happened on October 7th is horrific beyond imagination, right? And I don't even have to go into it. We've seen news, we've heard all the stories. I'm sure you've also heard it's the exact day, it's the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which again was another one of those days in Israel where they had no idea an attack was coming. It was a holy day, and all of a sudden they were attacked. It was done on that day, and it brought back a lot of things for a lot of people. The difficult piece about this is that most, and you may have seen this already, but most people say, why would they do this? Why would Hamas make this happen? And many people have argued that this is related to the fact that Israel has peace with Egypt. They have peace with Jordan. There's more normalizing relations starting to happen in the Middle East. And the U.S. had brokered a deal of an economic partnership between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so for the Iranians, who see the U.S. as an enemy, see Israel as an enemy, and they actually see Saudi Arabia as an enemy because they are Shia Muslims and they are Sunni, knew that the only way to destroy this thing from happening is to cause such upheaval that would turn the Middle East, that would put so much pressure that the Saudis could never enter into a deal. There's evidence that the Iranians and Hamas leadership met the Monday before all this happened. And on that level, you look at it and you say, well, once again, they were successful. You probably see a theme. Every time you get close to having peace, you have someone on the extreme end know that if you throw the monkey wrench into the system, in the end, the old animosities come back and they attack. And it breaks down. And it takes generations. The piece that, and I've probably talked long enough, we'll do questions. We can go into the whole wall, but we can talk about that if people have questions about it. Here's the dilemma. The part that makes this so tragic is you understand Israel's need for security. You understand Israel's history of we've always been attacked, we've always been persecuted, people are always against us. The Golda Meir doctrine was, right, they hit you with a stick, you come with a knife, they come with a knife, you come with a gun. You always hit them back harder to act as a deterrent. And it's the Israeli mindset. And everyone would say, you have the right to defend yourself, you have the right to, The problem becomes is that when the things we watch and see now, as some commentators have said, if you wipe out every last member of Hamas, the repercussions of what has happened to so many people, you've built a whole nother generation of people who won't look at this as, well, we'd love to sit down and come to the tables and talk peace. So this is where, again, as a Christian who hears the words of Jesus that always seemed a little bit upside down about turning other cheeks and going extra miles and loving enemies and those that persecute you, I think the entire world is watching this right now and saying the old ways of we'll just hit you harder doesn't make peace. And I'll stop at that and allow questions.
So we do have a few questions. The first question is, why have the Palestinians turned down 5 different times the establishment of a Palestinian state? And I'm just reading these questions that have been put.
That's a really interesting question, and we can debate details. not we, but like the people who write and talk about this, it's really interesting. There's so many layers to how Israel and Palestine and its history and the lack of cohesion within Palestinian leadership, which is part of what has made this so hard, is to find full agreement on what peace could or should look like. Because in every one of those near peace moments, and the last one was Arafat and Ehud Barak at Camp David with Bill Clinton, the Palestinians would have gotten a state with the vast majority of the territory, but not all the territory. And what autonomy looks like or doesn't look like within that state was also up for grabs. And so what becomes really hard, and I've spent time doing this, and this is why it's a great question, and I would encourage you to read into the negotiations of each of those situations, because newspaper headlines about in anything, this isn't even just Israel-Palestine, right? Anytime when it's like this side turned down or this side whatever, and you actually look at the layers of the negotiation, where the sticking points are, is always different. But it's never been for 100% of the land. And then there's the question of like what happens with the people who are in settlements and who do they belong to, and can you defend borders or not be defended, or so there's layers to every one of those. So it's not a simple, but it gives a good picture of the complexity of every one of these negotiations in different times and places. Great question.
So another question was related to the point that you made about mowing down the Gaza. How is this current Israel offensive different or not different than that periodic mowing?
That mowing the grass or mowing the lawn typically is 100% airstrikes by Israel. But those airstrikes have been nothing like the last few weeks of airstrikes. And again, the complexity of this is that Hamas will put their military like headquarters and weapons storage and all this kind of stuff in and around churches, mosques, hospitals, places we'd think as safe havens, which is that I dare you to shoot here. And then when that happens, you have a photo op. The other problem is so much of of Hamas's infrastructure in Gaza is in underground tunnels. So on the one where that neighborhood was just obliterated, and again, I don't know all Israeli intelligence, but what was being implied is like, hey, they had a lot of stuff, and it's in the tunnels that were right underground in that neighborhood, and we don't want to have to go into those tunnels and fight, and that's like a booby trap for all our people, and so by doing that, you wipe out what's underground. But this one, that there is now this extended campaign going into Gaza with the idea of they will on the ground go street by street and take all of Gaza is what they're saying. That's what makes this really different.
So another question is, what has led to the hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism throughout history?
You want that in 3 sentences or 5?
Just an easy one for you.
Here, let me take a shot at it. One, I think there's a sociological answer. So, well, there's probably a couple sociological answers, but one of them is like the Roma people or the people who are called gypsies, right, is another group of people who for a long swath of history have no homeland. They are a majority nowhere. They are always a minority living on the margins of society. That's been Israel throughout history, particularly within Christendom. So you had people, right, where you had a empire that was ruled from a perspective of Christianity, and they were seen as the theologically problematic people. You add to that the kind of classist perspectives. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you think about the fact, Judaism has always been a text-centered community. So the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all call themselves people of the book, okay? Because we're all centered on holy books, and we share some. But we know enough of Christian history to say that's why we have the beautiful stained glass windows, because for a lot of times most people couldn't read. And we know the stories, right, of everyone sitting in churches that's in Latin, where in the worst moments, even the priest didn't know the Latin. It's the same situation in Islam. The Quran is only the true Quran, word of God, if it's in Arabic. But only 25% of the Muslim world are Arabs, right? People can't read the holy books. Judaism has always had this perspective, and it's like a joke among Jews, is you can't be a good Jew and be illiterate. Because keeping the law is based upon study of Torah. And so if you're living in a European country in the Middle Ages, you could read Hebrew and Aramaic, so you clearly could read whatever your local language was as well, which creates this, the stereotype of, oh, all the Jews are lawyers and doctors and that kind of thing. It comes from a sense of, from earliest times, they were often the most educated people because they had to be literate. You then add the secondary thing, which is the other great Jewish stereotype, is that in Christendom that was trying to live out Scripture, it talks about in Leviticus about that it is immoral, it's against God's will for a brother to loan money to another and charge interest. But as you start moving in Europe towards economic systems that need money lending, the Jews were put in a position to be the bankers. Because you're a Jew, you're not a brother. So it's not immoral for us to loan money from you and for you to charge interest. So you look at, right, Shakespeare and Shylock, you get this idea about, the Jews being greedy and money grubbing, and well, that's what happens when you're poor peasants, and it's the Jews who are the bankers who cause you to be in a position where you might have to foreclose and lose your property, and it's those greedy people. And so there are all these things that factored in, and you still hear it, right? The idea, well, so the Jews own the world banks, and they own all the media. There's this great, because Jewish experience has been so horrible always, that's the stuff of great comedy. So, right, you have these great Jewish comics and great Yiddish jokes, and there's this great, little joke, in Yiddish of these two old Jewish guys sitting on the park bench. And the one guy's says, I'm so depressed. We're persecuted everywhere. We everybody's against us. I have people, we can't live in their neighborhoods. We have to live in this ghetto and all this kind of stuff. And life's all bad. And he turns to the other guys, why are you so happy? He says, every night, he goes, I sit down and I read that anti-Semitic newspaper that those people are punishing. What are you doing? Like, why does that make you feel better? I said, oh, it's great. We own all the banks. We control all the governments. We own all the media, right? So there's this, it's like, and this still, and I'll say it, what the heck, we've gone far enough. When you get in election cycles, like, just wait. This is what was beneficial for me going to a Jewish school. When I went to Hebrew Union College, as a good Christian American, it's like, look at that horrible stuff that happened in the Holocaust and those people, but that could never happen here. And if you're Jewish, most likely you have a mindset where they looked at me as like, you naive little fool. That can happen anywhere and any time. And, we end up in these elections, and sometimes people start talking about the people who control the banks. And for the Jewish community, they're like, get ready, they're coming for us again, right? Like, that stuff's always just below the surface, and it's on the rise. Yeah.
Well, I think that was much better than just a stab at the question,
Right.
So thank you for that. And I guess this could be our last question here, but how would you respond to some of the Christians who are almost celebrating because they are feeling that the worse this gets, their perspective on eschatology, Christian eschatology, is the worse it gets in the Middle East, the closer we get to the second coming of Jesus?
Yeah, this is the one that breaks my heart the most. And maybe because that's how I grew up. Right? I grew up in a tradition where, I had a pretty good wall chart that could tell you everything that was going to happen before we hit the rapture and the Great Tribulation. Israel always played a major role in that. So if you read dispensationalist eschatology, like the trigger that shows the end is nigh is Israel becoming a state again. And then it was going to be one generation from that. And when I was growing up, it was like, well, that's 40 years as a generation in the Bible. So, that book came out. Maybe no one ever read it, but it was traumatic about 88 reasons in 88 why Jesus was coming back. And that was my freshman year at college. And I'm like, I got to get in at least a few more years. But it didn't happen, so I was okay. But the guy did come out with a book, 89 Reasons in 89. He thought he missed one. That's a great question. Here's what I would say for the person who has that view. First, I would challenge everyone, and maybe that's your view, and again, I'm not here to be dismissive of your view, but what I would tell you is, all the things that you think you know about what has to happen before Jesus returns, or what will happen, sit down by yourself and work your way through the Bible and find where it actually says that. I love teaching in churches the book of Revelation. And sometimes I have to wear like a football helmet because it gets ugly. But it's like we have all these things that we know the book of Revelation tells us about. And then I said, before we talk about any of that, just let's read through the whole book. And we read through, and then they get into it because it's a great book. And then I asked, so wait, now tell me where the rapture was again. I'm like, oh, wait, what? And then it's like, tell me where this was, and tell me where the Bible says that this has to happen before that happens. And what you realize is those belief systems, and again, I live in a state of humility that says I can be wrong about anything, so maybe they got it right. But you need to understand that those positions are built on these really complicated, interconnected sets of interpretations that if you interpret this passage just this way, and this one over here just this way, and that one just this way, and you say, because it uses that word, it's probably alluding to this one, so if you bring these two together, and then think about it in light of that, it might mean this. And it's not as simple as we read it. Now, again, just to like mess you up a little bit more, there are other things that we are, say, major doctrines of the church that we believe that you realize they're doing the same thing. So, that's not a new practice. Reading the Bible's messy and complicated. So I end up finding myself when I see, because there's competing systems of that, right? The Presbyterians do it one way. I don't know what the UCC people do on this stuff, right? The Pentecostals do it another, right? And they all have their way of these complicated readings. And I'm always like, hey, good for you all. That's like a fun thing to do. But here's what I end up with. When I get into these battles, and again, I've learned about 25 years ago, I don't get in the battles. I like step back and talk about the battle with the people fighting. You will find that a certain group that does a lot of this, here's what's going to happen, here's what Israel's going to do, and here's how they're going to fight. And there's always some revelation stuff in there. But there's a lot of focus on ways to interpret Old Testament prophets. There's a lot of focus on, again, I'm an Old Testament Hebrew Bible guy, so I love that. But their eschatology focuses a lot on Hebrew prophets. When you focus on Jesus and gospel, it gets really hard to see where the person who's talking about laying down your life in love, who's talking about the Beatitudes, who's giving the Sermon on the Mount, who is calling us to be peacemakers, who's talking about bringing people together, would wrap the whole story up with killing a whole lot of people so that we can declare victory, right? And so that's a broader theological theme to say, if we understand all of Scripture, this is my now Lutheran background, right? If we read all Scripture, right, through the manger, we read it all through gospel, it would seem like that story would end in a loving, redemptive God who brings all people to himself. Versus, and I don't want to go into this, the Old Testament God, New Testament, but this more ancient Near Eastern view of Yahweh the warrior, in the end, proves his greatness by showing he can destroy everybody and be the last man standing, gender intended, king on the hill. Right? Like those are really two different kinds of theological streams. But the beauty is it's all interpretation.
Yeah.
So that's the fun of Bible.
Yeah. And thank you so much. Can we all thank Dean?
So again, thank you all for coming out tonight. I do want to strongly encourage you. Dean mentioned the book Blood Brothers. If you've not read it, it is a powerful and a very necessary read. I was sharing with a small group yesterday, day before, forget which day, talking about what can we do? And obviously, yes, we can pray. We can do things like we're doing here tonight. Let's learn more about this. Let's try to understand. There are a lot of very good resources, and I'm sure Dean can give us some more beyond that one. And, to read, to watch, stuff like that. As always, probably just Googling what should I think about Israel and Palestine probably isn't your best plan for what might come up from that. But there are a lot of resources. So I've got some. I know Pastor Amy has some, and Dean has some others, and I'm sure that he can get to us. As we close tonight, I want to close with a psalm that is, I think, one that echoes the feelings, I think, of, my guess, the people in Palestine, the people in Israel, people like us here, that is very much a lament to this. So this is Psalm 13, And there are 6 verses to it. And after the 4th verse, I'm going to just let us have a few moments of silence, and then I'll close it with the rest. How long, O Lord, will you forget me, forget us forever? How long will you hide your face from us? How long must we wrestle with our thoughts and day after day have sorrow in our hearts? How long will our enemies triumph over us? Look on us and answer, Lord my God. Give light to our eyes, or we will sleep in death. And our enemy will say, I have overcome them. And our foes will rejoice when we fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. We will sing the Lord's praise. For, Lord, you have been good to us. Amen. Again, thank you all for being here. Good night.